The 2-minute message preview this week at the non-denominational New Hope Olympia is the day God eavesdropped. God's jewels are precious. Pastor Dell's weekend message is based on Malachi chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. At the time of the writing of Malachi, the nation of Israel had strayed far from God. Those were dark days, indeed. Sin abounded. Unbelief prevailed. The majority of people went their way, giving little thought to the will of God or the ways of God. They laughed at the prophets and showed utter contempt for the law of God. Does all of this sound strikingly familiar? But even amid all this darkness, God had a remnant. He always does. He had a people who revered His name and sought to do His will. Their unwavering faith in the face of spiritual darkness is a beacon of inspiration for us all. As they saw the spiritual darkness of their day, they drew closer together for mutual support and encouragement. There were not many of them, but they were committed to remaining faithful to God, no matter what. They would meet in a secret place to encourage and cheer each other and find fellowship with one another, forerunners of the underground church. What specifically went on in those meetings? 1. They talked about the Lord. 2. They thought about the Lord. 3. They sang about the Lord. Everything they said and did revolved around God's person. In verse 16, Malachi tells us how God reacted to all of this. 1. He gave attention to what was going on. 2. He listened very carefully. 3. He eavesdropped. 4. He strained to hear their conversation, like a parent listening to the noises of a newborn baby in the night. 5. He shushed the angels that he might hear. Have you ever eavesdropped on anyone, listening carefully to hear what was being said? Sure you have. In that darkened day, when a spiritual awakening was so needed, thanks be to God, a few people thought about God's name. They talked about Him, revered Him, loved Him, and met to discuss His beautiful ways. And as they did, God eavesdropped. He tuned into their frequency. He strained to hear their remarks. It was like music to His ears. Malachi tells us in verse 16 that the Lord enjoyed it so much that He had it written down in a book. That's what the Lord does. He listens to our conversations, prayers, and testimonies, and if they're all about Him, He calls on an angel to take notes, to have a permanent record. And He delighted Himself with it. He writes down what was said and who said it, not as a task, but out of His deep love for His people. God's ears strained to hear what the remnant was saying. Kings were making edicts, but God was listening to His people. Generals were giving orders, but God listened to a handful of folks praising Him. Judges were speaking in court, but God was listening to His remnant. Politicians were making speeches, but God was not listening to them. His ears were tuned to His faithful followers. In verse 17, God says, "In that day when I make up my jewels, I'm going to remember that crowd and spare them." The word jewel, in Hebrew, means God's very own special possession or treasure. This is how God sees His faithful followers, as His most cherished and precious possessions. Here, He told David to stop playing his harp for a moment.